Well, welcome, beloved, to reality, and so glad that you've joined with us tonight for our tonight's teaching. Um, we are doing it a little bit different to sort of safeguard our team. We are doing these things separately in sheltering it in place, quarantine. We don't, there's been a spike in Lubbock, and so we're just trying to keep everybody safe. So I'm recording from home, and then Todd and Stephanie and Bethany will take this recording and they'll put it where it needs to be so it will play like it's supposed to. And you'll have this when normally we would be having our time on Facebook. And, uh, and then there will be others who will help join in managing and helping with this. Stephanie will be looking at Facebook. Emily will be looking at Facebook. Penny will be looking at Facebook if you want to be giving responses to this teaching. And you can reach me either through the Facebook page for Reality or the email address of scottrealitylbk@gmail.com in all of those different ways. So anyway, tonight is I'm recording from home and hoping to offer you a teaching that is beneficial to you. Before I get started, this tonight is Philippians 4, chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Why don't we read that together? And then I've got just some precursor questions for you to think about, and then I'll dive into the teaching for tonight. This is Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. I'm reading from the NIV version. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And beloved, those are our verses for tonight. Here's just three questions or three comments that I want to make just to present to you for you to be thinking about and then to dive into the teaching. First one is this: what is one of the best celebrations you have ever experienced? What is one of the best celebrations you have ever experienced? And I'm asking you to think about that because we enter into the text talking about a great celebration, a great rejoicing. I'll let you ponder that. You actually can pause the recording and think and ponder or talk with someone that's with you about that question, and then you can restart the recording. Here's the second thing. Now, because contentment, the topic of contentment is going to be a central focus of this teaching, which, by the way, I'm not real sure, and I'll confess this again in the teaching. I'm not sure I'm qualified to talk about it, but because it is, then there's two of these, a statement and a question that revolves around the topic of contentment. Finish the sentence. This is the second thing I want you to do. Finish the sentence. Contentment is not. Contentment is not. Now, my answer, if you want to pause now and not hear my answer, and discuss yours and then come back to mine, these are some of my reflections on that. Contentment is not happiness. Contentment is not having no desires or longing. In other words, having all of your desires and longings satisfied. That is not contentment. Contentment is not complacency. Contentment is not settling for less. Contentment is not peace. Now, I think they overlap, but I think there are uniquenesses to each one. Contentment is a lack of caring. I don't think that's contentment either. Contentment is not the absence of distress. those are some thoughts, and if you want to communicate yours to me, then I've given you avenues of how you can reach me, or you can put them on Facebook where we all can read. So this is another exercise that I think will just prepare your thinking for the teaching. And then finally it says, what goes into contentment that makes it contentment? What are the ingredients of contentment that makes it contentment? So there you have, those are the precursors. And so here comes the teaching. You ready? Have you ever been in a rough spot in your life where you know you are in over your head? That ever happened to you? You don't know what you're going to do because you don't have what it takes to do anything. And then, unbeknownst to you, a friend or a group of friends or even a stranger at just the right moment appears and provides you with answers to your problems. You're blown away. Has that ever happened to you? Has anything like that ever happened to you? In 2015, I had and in my lifetime, I'd had 2 surgeries on my right knee just to hold it together. But by 2015, the knee was actually caving in on itself. And Diane and I were beginning to shop for wheelchairs for me, so that I could get around, because it was becoming clear that I wasn't being able to walk or even stand. And there were days that I could walk. There were days I could walk with a cane. There were days I could walk with crutches, and there were days that I stayed home in the chair. And so we didn't have an answer to the knee. And then a man who found out about my situation offered a way for me to have knee replacement surgery. Now, let's see if I can show you a picture. This was my knee. See if you can see it. You can see all the jagged points, and if you can notice, you can begin to see how this is caving in into the bone below. Lots of bone spurs and things like that. And it was becoming a mess. And so this man provided a way for me to have knee replacement surgery. And so at the end of April 2015, I had knee replacement surgery, and you can see the massive difference. Yeah, and I want you to know, I could hardly believe the gift. It was actually a brand new life, getting that knee replacement. Well, beloved, this is where Paul is when he begins verse 10 in chapter 4. He has been in prison where even bare necessities are not given. Prisoners in that day starved to death in those prisons. They died of dehydration in those prisons. They would die sometimes of hypothermia. But then Epaphroditus from Philippi shows up, and he is with food. He has food, water, blankets, money. So Paul writes the church at Philippi a thank you letter. That's what this letter to the Philippians is. He has several things he wants to talk about to them, but as he closes the letter, he comes back. He starts with thank you, and now as he's coming to a close, he comes back to his gratefulness for them. And that's where we start with verse 10 of chapter 4. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord. Now this also can be translated, I celebrated greatly. And like I said in the precursor, what does celebrate greatly look like to you? Right now in the Latham nation, Jonah, Noah, and Emily are engaged, and I have gotten to just rejoice greatly over their engagement. And has the Lord ever done anything, either directly or through another person or persons, that gave you a reason to celebrate greatly? Do you know what that looks like? When Diane and I were in the clinic in Phoenix for her treatment, the first time, every month, they would take an evaluation and see how well the treatment was working against the cancer. And the first time, at the end of the first month, um, when the report came back, what would happen is that one of the nurses would come into your room, and she would tell you what the results was, and then of course there was rejoicing between you and that nurse. Now Diana had a number of nurses that took care of her. Most of them were from Cuba. And so that first time we came into the clinic, and there was a nurse. She was coming in for some treatment. Before she ever got to her room, there was a nurse that stopped her. And as the nurse stopped her, she said, "I have something to tell you." And at first we didn't realize it was the day that you'd be getting this report. And then when she said that, there was like 7 or 8 other nurses that gathered around her. Now you can imagine, most of these women were from Cuba, and so you please use that to imagine their ability to celebrate. And so then she read the report to Diana, and so then they all started clapping. Some of them began to jump up and down and kind of dance around her. Some of them hugged her, and it just the memory of that celebration brings me to tears every time. They celebrated greatly the fact that she was winning her challenge at that time. Let me challenge you with this. The Lord's great goodness is all around you, all the time, in all of your circumstances. And, beloved, this is partially what was being said in the verses before we got started, in verses 8 and 9, where he talks about whatever is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy. It's this idea of realizing that the Lord's great goodness is all around you. It's at play in all of your circumstances, in all of your moments. This is to tell us to ponder and put into practice things that are saturated with God's goodness. This is what verses 8 and 9 are about. This is pointing to the reality that God's generous goodness is everywhere, meaning as one who is in relationship with Almighty God, we have the capacity to celebrate and rejoice greatly, even in troubled circumstances, terrible circumstances. I can say to you now, beloved, I'm not there yet, but I will also say to you, I want to be there, where I can celebrate greatly, no matter the circumstances. Now, verse 10 continues on. It says, "I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it." Now, the word renewed here is a botanical word that describes a flower blooming after a long winter. And Paul is saying that the Philippians are being allowed to blossom their concern after a time where they had no opportunity to show it. Now, we don't know what he means by no opportunity. This could mean the Philippians were dealing with hardships due to persecution, and they didn't have any way to really give to him. Or it could mean that they didn't have a way to bridge the 800 miles that was between them. Or it even could mean that they weren't real sure where he was, that they had lost track of him and didn't know, where to send help. All of this is really sheer speculation, but now they are giving bloom to their concern, tangible, self-sacrificing expressions of their love. They are blooming this love towards him. So I just want to pause right here. I think this is worthy to take a moment and just ask the question, who in your life needs to know your love? Who in your life needs to know a sense of a tangible, concrete expression that you bloom your love towards them? The other day I was talking to a friend who was trying to figure out how to love on someone in his community. And he had called me to to talk about this. This person in his community, him and his wife were concerned about. She was a single mom who had recently lost both of her parents. In other words, she had lost her support system. And so he was just saying, what could I do to love on her? I don't know what to do. And so I just started making suggestions. I said, well, why don't you gather some of the people at the church and y'all put together a fund and you purchase, a meal and DoorDash it to her house once or twice a week, just so that she doesn't have to fix supper for those kids after a long day at work. Or, some of the men could take responsibility that when she comes to church, someone comes by and takes her car and fills it up with gas and then brings it back to the church for her. That way she didn't have to go fill her car up with gas. And I said, you could even cue some of the older women who are at home all day to call her and say, listen, bring me your laundry. And I'll do your laundry while you're at work and you can come by and pick it up. I mean, these are ways, tangible, concrete ways to love on this person. This is what I'm asking. Who is a Paul in your life who is needing some fresh expressions of love from you or a group of you? You understand what I'm trying to say? Okay, well, we've made it through verse 10. Took us more than 15 minutes to do that. Here we go, verse 11. He says, I'm not saying this because I am in need. Okay, now I'm going to use a cowboy term with you here. Hold up. Wait a minute. Really? You're not? Because I am in need? Okay, is Paul just being stoic here? He is in prison. He doesn't even have the basic essentials for living. What is he meaning in this verse? Well, first of all, I want to be clear. He's not saying he is not needy. He doesn't say that. He's not saying that he's not aware of his need either. He's not saying that either. It is obvious that he's needy. He is saying that his neediness is not what is shaping what he is saying to them in this letter. It is God's goodness demonstrated by the Philippians that is causing him to greatly rejoice. The word there is mega rejoice. His focus is God's goodness that is coming to him through the Philippians, not his neediness. And he goes on to say that his neediness is not an issue for him because he has learned to be content. Okay, here we are now, beloved. Confession time. I've already said this to you, but I'm going to say it to you again. Paul, in this statement that he has learned to be content, for me, has just left the planet and has gone somewhere in the stratosphere. He now begins to talk about something I am not sure I even have the right to talk to you about. Paul has brought us to a topic that is mostly outside my reach, if I'm really honest. And that topic is contentment. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you some things. I'm going to share with you some things that are from just some observations and maybe some practices or taste of contentment that the very edge of it that I have discovered. First of all, I want you to notice, and Paul says, I have learned. So I'm going to say to you that I think for most of us, contentment is just not natural. It's not a natural thing for us. It is something that for the most of us, we have to learn. For the most part, for the most of us, we have to somehow engage in an educational process in learning how to be content. We have to learn how to be content with what we have and what we don't have. We have to learn how to be content with where we are and where we are not. And we have to learn how to be content with who we are and who we are not. The word learned here is in this verse is in the aorist tense. It means he learned over a long period of time. This learning did not happen in a flash. It was like, oh, I got it, and now I'm off and running No, no, no. It was over and over and over. It was a long process. And this idea of it being a long process is supported by the word in verse 12. He uses the word secret. Now, the word secret is not about keeping something hidden. It is communicating the idea that commitment is something that is to be discovered. You have to pursue knowledge about it. You have to pursue understanding about it. You must discover your way into it. So, the first thing I want to lay at your feet is that I think contentment is something that you learn. Now, secondly, contentment does not depend on what you have or don't have, and it doesn't depend on your circumstance. Whatever your circumstances might be, does not determine contentment. Notice in verse 11, whatever the circumstances. And then in verse 12, in any and every situation, those words are used. And then he says, and at the very end of 12, whether living in plenty or living in want. That means poverty. Now, catch something there that he's saying. I didn't see it at first, and that just may mean that I'm slow and you're fast. You probably caught it right off the bat. Usually we think of contentment as something that you strive for when you don't have what you want or need. But Paul here is suggesting the other end of the continuum. That contentment, it needs to be strived for when you have plenty. Having all you want and need does not promise contentment either. In fact, your circumstances, good or bad, do not determine your contentment. That's what he's saying. Contentment is something independent of all circumstances. Consider this example and what I'm trying to say here. J.D. Rockefeller was probably, he's probably one of the richest persons of his day. He lived in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Today, his wealth would be estimated to be somewhere over $4 billion. Now, I know that's just a drop in the bucket when you compare that to Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who is worth $116 billion today. But in Rockefeller's day, the average yearly income was under $1,400, less than $1,400 per year. His wealth was astronomical to anyone else in America. Now, one day he was asked, how much money is enough? And he answered, just a little bit more. No matter how much we have, we often want one more thing. We want more even when we have all we need. In other words, we can also lack contentment when we are living in abundance. The myth that if you have what you want, that equals contentment is just not true. Contentment is not dependent on your situation, even if your situation is marvelous, incredible. It has nothing to do with your circumstances. That's number 2. Number 3 is verse 13. Verse 13 is probably the most misquoted verse in the Bible. Or at least it may be accurately quoted, but it's often quoted out of context. It is often to use that verse 13, chapter 4, verse 13, is often used to mean that through Christ, nothing is beyond your capabilities. Like I can conquer and overcome anything that comes my way. This verse is really, it's really not about that. It's really more about finding sufficiency for yourself in your circumstances, sufficiency in times of want or in times of plenty in Christ, in Jesus. This means contentment has really nothing to do with self-sufficiency. Uh, it's not about through him I can do all things. It's not. In fact, I'm not even sure the verse says that in the Greek. Now, in Paul's day, contentment. Let me back up just a little bit. In Paul's day, contentment was considered a top virtue. It's one of the most important ones in the Greek world. In the Greek mind, though, contentment was self-sufficiency. It was done in self-strength or in willpower. So here Paul is addressing that issue. He's directly stating something that is countercultural in his day. Paul is saying contentment is not self-sufficiency, it is self-dependency. Now, we can be content in whatever the circumstances are because Jesus strengthens us to do so, not because we find the strength in ourselves. Contentment is not a result of because I'm in Jesus, I automatically have all the strength I need to face any situation. It's not what this is saying. It's not saying that contentment is found in superhuman strength provided to me by Jesus. By the way, that's bordering on a stoic belief. Contentment is not ignoring your needs. I mean, that would be like the Hindus. That's what they believe, that you need to, that they don't exist, your needs don't exist. It is not complacency either, which essentially means to be pleased with yourself or self-satisfied. Notice the central word there, self. It's all about self. Paul is saying contentment is not self-sufficiency, not self-satisfaction, but it is self-surrender. Contentment is depending, trusting, relying on Jesus to be enough. To be enough in whatever you face. Contentment is found in Jesus. Now notice the slight, subtle movement. Contentment is not in the strength that Jesus gives. Contentment is found in Jesus and the strength that comes with him. Contentment is found in Jesus, who gives his strength to sustain you and me in any situation, good or bad. Contentment is not looking to your situation to be enough. I'm going to make my situation enough for me. Or I think I can grow my situation or circumstances to become enough for me. It is looking for Jesus. It is looking to Jesus and trusting that he is enough. When we have that trust, when we can grow that trust in Jesus, then we're moving towards contentment. Contentment is growing in trust that Jesus is sufficient for any situation. Let me pause here and ask this question. How do you grow trust in a person? Well, what's your answer to that question? How do you grow trust in a person? And my answer to that is this. You grow trust by getting to know a person deeper and deeper. And so then that leads me to this question. Are you doing that with Jesus? You see, beloved, I believe that, today's trust that you have in Jesus is a certain amount. It's a certain measure. And I know that your trust pleases him. But I'm going to say to you that tomorrow's trust that you're going to need for tomorrow and the next day is going to need to be bigger, and he is going to want it to be bigger. And so it's not just that we trust in Jesus. Do you trust in Jesus? Yes. That's a great question, but the better question is your trust growing in Jesus? Because it needs to be growing to face tomorrow. Are you growing your trust in him? That's moving you towards contentment. Now, beloved, remember we said contentment is something you learned. I want to kind of return back to that. Let's kind of go back to that. And I want to ask this question. What helps you learn to be content? Well, I'm going to offer some observations. I'm not real sure that these are accurate, but just hear my attempts to get at this and understand that it's an attempt because I feel like I myself am on the edge of contentment. I'm not in the center of it. I'm not accomplished at it, but I am attempting to hand some things to you so that you can, it's like the baton. I can hand you this and you take off with it. I'm trying to do the same myself, but I can only offer to you what has been present in my world about it. And so here we go. Just some observation of how we learn to be content. One of the things I think is important is that we learn to practice gratitude. It seems to me that there's some kind of connection between gratefulness and contentment. And so when we learn to practice gratitude on a regular basis, and if I could even go so far to say practice it every day, and one of the ways that this is just one way that I've observed this is that I've watched Diana over years and years and years. Every night she would enter into a journal. She called it her grateful journal. She would write 5 things. This is right before she would turn out her lamp on the side of the bed and lay down and go to sleep. She would write 5 things she was grateful for that day. And she did this for years and years and years. And her goal was to never write down the same thing. That just blows my mind. But I also, as she practiced as the year, days, weeks, months, years went on, I watched her become a more and more content person. I practiced this myself, and I can say that that's exactly what it did to me as well. So there's just something between gratitude and contentment. And so practicing gratefulness, to me, lends itself in us learning how to be contented. It's like gratitude begins to show us how we are surrounded, how we are saturated by God's goodness. And so what begins to rise up in my heart is this openness to contentment. Now, here's a second observation that I've made about how we learn to become content, and it's really stopping something, not going and doing something like practicing gratitude. It's really learning how to eliminate comparison out of our lives. Comparison in my mind is toxic to contentment. When you begin to compare yourself or your circumstances to another, contentment begins to evaporate, and what begins to take its place is coveting and envy. And so those things begin to kind of grow instead of contentment. Contentment requires, to me, the elimination of comparison. The third thing that I would offer is contentment involves taking the long view on things. When I'm talking to young adults, a lot of times their perspective is just the now, just right now. And they don't have a sense of any kind of long view of their situation and their circumstances or the issues that they're facing. And I find that often when their view is just centered around, encapsulated in just right now, then it's very, very hard for them to discover any kind of contentment about their situation. But when they begin to let their point of view be informed from an eternal perspective, from heaven's point of view, then often what begins to happen is that begins to foster a sense of contentment in them. That's what I mean by contentment often involves taking the long view on things. And then finally, just a last observation is contentment includes knowing who God says you are. Paul was clear about that, and I think that's what gave him, was a catalyst for him to be learning how to be content. If you do not know who you are, you won't know contentment. I've just observed that in people over and over and over. Contentment, in my mind, includes listening to God in silence, and solitude and allowing Him to tell you who you are. And beloved, I would start with just offering you the idea of the words that were spoken to Jesus when John the Baptist baptized the Lord Jesus, and he came up out of the water and God spoke. You remember those words? This is my son, and I'm going to expand that because this to me includes this. This is my son or daughter in whom I am well pleased, because I believe that if you're in Christ, those words are meant for you too. This is my son or daughter in whom I am very pleased. I think when you know what God thinks about you, that helps you move towards contentment. And then, beloved, to me, that would also include in what God thinks of you, would also include what your purpose is. And when you find the meaning of life for yourself, I think that begins to bring contentment. This morning I was in a meeting, and it was, the meeting included this talk from a fella that's in England, very famous fella. And in the talk, he mentioned some things that I thought I would just add to you. I know this is a long teaching, I apologize, but I just needed to get this in front of you for you to give some consideration to it. He was talking about Leo Tolstoy, who really struggled with contentment in his life. And he tried all kinds of things to find the meaning of his life. And this was one of the questions that Tolstoy asked himself. What meaning does my life have that death cannot destroy? In other words, it lives on after me. It outlives me. And I think when you can begin to answer that question, then contentment is at your front door. He told the story, this preacher that I listened to this morning told the story of this person who was learning a language, learning the English language. And she entered into a room where some exciting things was happening, and she meant to say, "What on earth are you doing?" But instead what she said was, "What are you doing on earth?" Which again, when you can begin to answer that question fully, then I think contentment is knocking at your door. And then Jim Carrey, the actor, he said something like this. This isn't an accurate quote, but it's something like this. Get everything you want so you can realize that really isn't what you want. That makes sense. Contentment is not found there. Well, beloved, this is an offering to you. Let me just finish with some questions. It's an offering for you to give some consideration to what Paul says in verses 10 through 13. Do you know this contentment Paul is talking about? Are you learning to be content, not through self-sufficiency, but through self-surrender to Jesus? How do you need to enlarge gratitude, the practice of gratitude in your life? And how do you need to decrease comparison in your life? And how do you need to be growing your trust in King Jesus? Well, beloved, I hope there was benefit for you in this teaching. I hope that somehow God has spoken to you through this broken attempt to bring this teaching to you. May God bless you and keep you until we get to meet again. Be blessed.